Here we are today to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the big fire that destroyed much too much of this house. It started on this very day, exactly 25 years ago, and it started in this bedroom here, which I was occupying then with my sister. It seems to have started when we were having lunch. It was a Sunday afternoon, and one of my brothers, I think, left table a bit early because he was stuffed, and he came back seconds later and said, "Smells of smoke." So my father leapt up, of course. He ran into the hall, raised his eyes to the ceiling, and saw quite a lot of smoke. So he grabbed the one and only extinguisher we had back then and ran upstairs. He saw it was probably coming from the west wing, and he opened the door and and was almost blown over by all the smoke. I think he fell to the floor to try and put it out, but without actually even being able to see exactly where it was coming from, how it had started, or where it had started, to be more precise. And it was so pointless, he couldn't even see where it was coming from. So he came back out, choking, coughing up an awful lot of smoke, and said, "Everyone out. I'm calling the fire brigade." And so that's what we did. We got out, we collected up the dog and the cat, and we waited on the front lawn, and all we could see was a bit of smoke at first coming out of one of the windows, and we thought that, well, if the nearest fire brigade is 3 kilometers away, they would be here quite soon. So we were confident, and we waited and waited and waited, and the first fire engine arrived 45 minutes later. So we saw from the front lawn the first flames coming out of this window here, and I just remember the feeling of panic rising because obviously I'd never seen the house on fire, and we weren't ever reckoning with this sort of thing happening. But I do remember seeing the first panes cracking and thinking, "Oh God, come on, please come and turn it off." And yeah, they arrived 45 minutes later. And so what happened was that they couldn't get through the columns, the 2 pillars at the beginning of our driveway, because fire engines of course are quite big, and the columns were not made for that. They were made for horse-drawn carriages, no doubt, some time ago, and so they couldn't really fit through those 2 pillars without knocking the top crooked. But that's a minor detail. I think a couple of fire engines got stuck in the drive because it was not very solid underfoot, and so fire engines being very heavy, they got stuck. And after 45 minutes, it was rather late as well. It was quite late in the day to put out the fire at the beginning, because after 45 minutes you understand that the entire roof was on fire. So when I say we're commemorating this day, it's not with any pleasure, but it was very easily one of the 2 worst days of my life. Next, the fire engines tried not to get too near the burning chateau because they didn't want to put themselves in any danger, understandably, and they couldn't get enough pressure on the hose. They couldn't unroll the hose very fast either, for whatever reason, or I think maybe the hose wasn't quite long enough from that distance. So they had to fetch an extra bit of hose, which they fastened. It was one disaster after another, really. And with all these little problems we had, one after the other, if it weren't so dramatic, it would be comedy gold. It would be something out of a Monty Python sketch or something. But the fact is, it was really dramatic on that day. We were all in tears by the time the firemen arrived. At the end of the day, I think there were 7 different fire brigades which had sent their firemen. But you have to understand, it wasn't their fault. It's the system that's so imperfect, and it's something you have to laugh about. Otherwise, you'd be mad at them all the time. It's not the firemen who are at fault at all, because they're not professional firemen. They're bénévoles, so they're volunteers. They're not like the firefighters of New York or any other big city. They do this out of the kindness of their hearts, I suppose, or to do something noble. Maybe they enjoy putting out fires as well. I suppose they do, and saving people. But it's the system that's quite ridiculous, because when my father made that call, the call did not go to Lieuret, which is 3 kilometers away, which is the first fire brigade, the nearest one. It went to Évreux, which is the main town of the département de l'Eure, which is the department we live in. And Évreux is by road about 3/4 of an hour to 1 hour away, which is not relevant. It's just to say it's not next door. And so they received this call and said, they thought to themselves, the chateau of some obscure village is on fire. So they say, we'll see if it's not a joke. We'll call the mayor of Moraville to see if it's true. So they tried to reach the mayor, who was not at home because it was Sunday midday or early afternoon, and he was enjoying a probably quite long Sunday meal with his in-laws. So by the time they discovered this and managed to reach him on the phone, the mayor answered, I have no idea if it's a joke. I'm not in Moraville. I'm going to try and call someone from the village and see if it's true or not. So he did. He reached someone who looked out the window and said, oh, yes, there's a lot of smoke. From then on, things started to move faster, but it was several minutes before they'd reached that point. And by the time they'd called all the firemen, they'd got their kit on and had hit the road, the roof was on fire. The entire roof was on fire, and we'd literally seen the beginning of the fire. So it was very bitter. The whole story was one big train wreck. Some things, some details I remember very vividly. I mean, it was 25 years ago. I must have been, 17, 18, something like that. And a lot of it you do sort of blot out because it's obviously not my most fond memories. But some things I do remember quite well. A lot of people from the village saw what was going on, so they ran up to their house, to the front of the house, and they did what they could to get a lot of furniture and things out of the house as much as they could, only from the ground floor because everything else was out of the question. So I remember that they were carrying furniture out of this window here with the help of the firemen, and at one point this dormer here was so wobbly that they saw it was going to fall, and it almost fell on some inhabitants of the village and some firemen. And at one point they decided it was just too dangerous to get into the house to do anything further. So they really didn't have much other option. They just pointed their hoses from here, from the ground. They pointed the hoses up, and they just poured water onto the first floor as best they could. And that did an awful lot of damage as well, although at that point, it was a bit too late for anything. And I do remember also very clearly the moment when the ceiling of that side here, this entire ceiling here, just collapsed under the weight of the water, of all the water they'd poured onto the house. So the roof was gone, the ceiling was gone. I can tell you, the next day when we went back to the house to have a look at just how bad it had been, you walked into the sitting room, you looked up and you saw the sky. There was nothing left. So quite a few things we did manage to put into the pigeon tower here through this very small door. And we were very thankful to the people of the village who helped us with that. As you can imagine, we lost an awful lot of things. We lost all our clothes, which is not a disaster as such, but it does mean that the next day we didn't even have we didn't even have underwear. We had nothing to put on except what the kind villagers brought us. They brought us, you know, a couple of sacks full of clothes that they didn't necessarily need anymore, and they thought, you know, they've got nothing to wear. Let's bring them some clothes to put on. But yes, after all the years of hard work that my parents had put into this house, it was it was very, very sad to see. And it just afterwards, we weren't at all sure that we were going to be able to reconstruct it, because at first you don't know that. You think, damn, we have an insurance, but what's it going to cover? And to be honest, most people who suffer such an enormous loss don't rebuild. And everyone from the village said later, when we heard you were rebuilding, we're thinking they're completely crazy. They're out of their minds. But I remember the first few days afterwards were very bleak, because I was just thinking we're homeless, and we'd put so much energy, time, money too, let's face it, into this house, and we just loved it so much. And my father very nearly cried on that day. My mother was a nervous wreck, so was I. It was bad. So now I'm going to show you the footage that one of our neighbors who lives directly opposite us made back then, on that fateful day. It's still really hard for any of us to watch. Brings back very horrible memories, and just this awful feeling of despair, really.
peut-être bien vous pousser les...
Voilà, alors une piscine, ça serait mieux. À mon avis, ouais, mais tiens, on va y aller plein dans 5 minutes. On prenait ton jus. Il y en a une qui est pas les plaindre. T'as dit celle de... elle a rien à côté. Celle qui est là. Ouais, c'est juste plus haut quand même. Et puis les doigts. Non, attendez. Et puis les doigts, parce que les doigts. En plus, avec la poisson, ils ont vu quelque chose, c'est vite. Attends, c'est encore. Ça, c'est encore. Mais ça, il y a même plus de voiture maintenant. À part que les darons. Oula, ça va faire mal. Le mec, il a des lignes pour aller l'escalier, il peut se faire. Ah non, ils ont mis dans le truc. Il y a une petite fenêtre. Attends, et puis après, il y a celle. Oh, moi, j'ai pas vu ça. Tu vas aller quand? Oh là, il y a un mec qui est dérangé, il balance la caméra, il fait quand même. Tire.
The whole place just smelled so awful afterwards in the days following the fire. You know, when a house burns like that, anyone out there will know who's lost their house. It doesn't smell of nice wood fire in the fireplace. It just smells of burned house, burned belongings. It's such a stench. And I can still smell it now when I think back. So as most fires are, the day had started a perfectly normal Sunday, and it had ended with, we have no house. All my parents' belongings, all the little objects they'd brought back from their travels over the years in a number of foreign countries had been destroyed. The left side of the house, when you face it, had been ripped out. And that's it. And that's the worst bit, because I mentioned clothes a bit earlier on, but I mean, who cares about the clothes? You know, it's just stuff. Even the objects my parents collected are just stuff, in fact. But the worst bit, the very worst bit, was the house itself. It had stood more than 300 years, and now one half of it had just been ripped out completely. And that is definitely the most bitter part as well. It's that we had seen the fire contained, and 3/4 of an hour later it was too late. Everything had gone. So, and this video is, of course, partly a homage to my father and my mother, who at least for my father's part, remained quite cruel. He did keep his focus at least on what was important, and in the aftermath he did do the necessary steps one by one to find out what the situation was, where we could go from there, if it was possible to rebuild, how much we could rebuild, which materials we would use, just everything step by step. He took it one step at a time. So for those of you who have followed this channel from the start, this is partly just a commemoration video, but also to explain why it's taken us, or why it's been taking all this time to redo the house, because maybe some of you have wondered why, if my parents bought this house in '83, we're still not finished now. But that might go part of the way to explaining why. That was an enormous setback, as you can imagine. Now, this fire actually made it onto the regional news that evening on the television. Unfortunately, I'm not able to use it for my vlog. It's not allowed. So my siblings and I have blotted out a lot of it, and my father not being with us anymore, he can't tell us what he remembers. But I asked my mum for her take.
Well, as anybody who's had a house fire knows, it's the most awful, disgusting thing that can happen. We didn't have any loss of life. We managed to rescue the dogs and the cats immediately. But it was almost as bad as the death of a family member. All your souvenirs disappear. For several years afterwards, I couldn't look at a garden bonfire, a hearth fire, and the smell afterwards is just revolting, and it lasts for so long. A fire is so relentless. We watched it spreading right along the length of the house, and we could see as it went through each room. We thought, such and such has disappeared, and then the next room, we knew what was in the rooms. It's just absolutely horrendous. And one of the amazing things was that we finally had 7 fire brigades all pouring water into the house, and the cellars, which run the whole length of the house, were absolutely, completely full of water. And a couple of days later, that water had disappeared. And we've never understood how it was evacuated, because there are no holes down there, nothing visible. It's just extraordinary.
The day the house burnt was a very long day. Seeing all your home, all your belongings, all your childhood memories, really. The place where you grew up and where you spent so many years, and where you have so many shared memories, going up in flames. Well, losing all that's a moment that will stay with you your whole life.